A woman walks into town empty-handed, her body heavy, and no one welcomes her, only mocking laughter from all sides. They say she won't last a week. They're wrong. Because that woman not only survives, she changes an entire land. This is the story of Clara Whitmore, the outcast who discovers a secret that could overthrow the most powerful man in the region and who proves that true power is never what one sees with the naked eye. Comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. And watch to the end because this is a story you won't want to miss. The wagon had left her 3 miles back. That was how Clara Whitmore came to be standing at the edge of Red Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1874, with the sun pressing down on her like a physical weight and the dust from the road still settling into the folds of her skirt. She hadn't planned to walk. She'd paid for a ride all the way to the edge of town, or thought she had, but the driver, a man with a sun-cracked face and a wad of tobacco bulging his left cheek, had looked her over when she climbed into the flatbed and made a calculation. He'd announced, about a mile outside of Red Hollow, that her weight was costing his horse too much in this heat, and that the arrangement was finished. She'd argued. Politely at first, then less so. He hadn't responded to either version. He'd simply stopped the wagon, waited, and when she didn't move fast enough, he'd picked up her canvas bag and dropped it into the road. So she walked. 3 miles isn't far, under normal conditions. But the summer of 1874 had scorched the Texas hill country into something barely recognizable as land worth living on. The grass along the road had gone the color of old straw. The creek beds Clara passed were cracked mud, not water. The air smelled of heat and something else she couldn't name. Something underneath the heat, almost like rot, the smell of things slowly giving up. She'd been on the road for 11 days coming out of Abilene, catching rides where she could, sleeping in wagon beds and once in the corner of a livery stable, eating when there was something to eat and drinking from whatever sources she could find. By the time Red Hollow came into view, she was down to her last 8 cents. Her feet had blistered through the wool stockings she'd been wearing since Kansas, and the canvas bag she was carrying had grown so heavy in her arms that she'd switched it from side to side every 20 steps or so since the second mile. She was 23 years old, and she didn't look it. She looked older, weathered, and she was aware of how she looked. Not vain about it, just aware, the way you become aware of things that have caused you trouble often enough. Red Hollow was not an impressive town. It had one main street, a general store, a land office, 2 saloons, a livery, a church without a steeple, and a scattering of buildings whose purposes weren't immediately clear. There was a hotel of sorts, a 2-story structure with a sagging second-floor porch, and a sign that had lost 2 of its letters. The street was unpaved, and the midday heat had turned it to something close to powder, so that every step Clara took sent up little puffs of dust around her boots. She made it approximately 40 yards down the main street before her legs decided they were done. It wasn't dramatic, the way it happened. There was no warning moment where she might have sat down somewhere dignified. Her knees simply buckled. She caught herself with one hand, scraping her palm open on the packed earth, and then she was down on one knee in the middle of the street with her canvas bag beside her and the sun overhead and the whole town, or whatever portion of it was currently out of doors, watching. The laughter started almost immediately. It came from the porch of the nearest saloon. 3 men sitting in chairs tilted back against the wall, hats pulled low, nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon. One of them said something Clara couldn't make out. Another one laughed. Within 30 seconds there were more people, drawn out by the sound, and the laughter had acquired company, comments, observations, a woman's voice from somewhere to the right saying, "Lord have mercy," in a tone that was not merciful. Clara stayed where she was for a moment. Her hand was bleeding. Her vision had that washed-out quality that comes before fainting, the edges going white. She was acutely conscious of how she looked, heavy, sweating, down on one knee in the dirt, hair coming out of its pins, dressed dark with perspiration. She was also conscious of the fact that every person within eyeline was looking at her with some variation of amusement or disdain, and that not one of them was moving toward her. She tried to get up. Her legs weren't ready. She tried again and got halfway before something cramped in her left calf, and she went back down. "Gonna need a team of oxen," somebody said, loud enough to carry, and the laughter got louder. She'd heard that kind of thing before. She'd heard variations of it her whole life. What she hadn't found yet was a reliable way to stop it landing the way it landed, like a stone thrown at something already bruised. She kept her eyes on the ground in front of her and breathed through her nose and tried her legs again. "That's enough." The voice was quiet. It wasn't raised. It didn't have the particular edge of a man trying to perform authority. It was just flat and even, and somehow more effective for it. The laughter didn't stop entirely, but it pulled back, became self-conscious, the way people laugh, when someone has quietly indicated that what they're laughing at isn't actually funny. The boots that appeared in Clara's line of sight were worn at the heel and dusty. The leather cracked along the toe of the left one. They stopped about a foot in front of her. Then a hand came down. Not rushed, not particularly gentle, just offered. Clara looked up. The man attached to the hand was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way that comes from outdoor work rather than deprivation, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't been shaved in a few days. He wasn't looking at her with pity, which she would have found humiliating, or with the kind of aggressive charity that people sometimes deployed as its own form of condescension. He was just looking at her the way you'd look at someone who needed a hand up. "You need to get out of the street," he said. "I'm aware," Clara said. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite a smile. "Can you stand?" "I could stand fine this morning. I walked 3 miles in this heat." "Then you did more than most people in this town would do." He kept the hand where it was. "Take it or don't. Either way, you shouldn't be in the middle of the street." She took it. He pulled her up with less effort than she'd expected, which told her he was stronger than his build suggested. He didn't make any comment about her weight. He didn't grunt or brace himself conspicuously. He just pulled, and she was standing, and then he picked up her canvas bag without being asked and carried it to the shade of the nearest porch overhang. "Silas Mercer," he said, not looking at her, scanning the street like he was checking whether anyone was going to be a problem about this. "Clara Whitmore." "You have somewhere to be in Red Hollow, Miss Whitmore?" She considered the truth, which was no. She considered what to do with the truth, which was usually the harder problem. "I was told there might be work here." "Who told you that?" "A woman in Abilene. She said the valley was ranching country, and ranches always needed hands." Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at her in a way that was assessing but not unkind, taking in the blistered condition she was in, the state of her dress, the cut on her palm she was pressing closed with 2 fingers. "What kind of work?" "Whatever kind there is. I can cook. I can keep books. I know how to manage a kitchen and how to keep accounts, and I learn quickly." That's a broad answer. It's a broad offer. Another pause. He was looking at the street again. "My ranch is 3 miles north of town. I've got a crew of 4 hands, a cook who quit last month, and a set of account books that haven't been properly touched in 2 years. I can offer room, board, and a fair wage, though what counts as fair right now is dependent on what the season does." He turned back to her. "This drought has hit everyone hard. I won't pretend otherwise." "I'm not looking for pretending," Clara said. "I'm looking for work. You'd need to get to the ranch." "I can walk." "You just fell down in the middle of Main Street." That was then. He looked at her for another moment. Then something did shift in his expression, just slightly. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it. "I've got a wagon hitched at the livery. Give me 10 minutes. So she sat on the porch and drank the water he sent out from the saloon. Not liquor, just water, which someone brought without comment. And she watched Red Hollow go about its afternoon business. And she thought about the last 11 days and whether this was better or worse than what she'd left in Abilene. In Abilene, she'd had a job at a boarding house, managing the accounts and doing the morning baking. She'd had a room on the 2nd floor and a window that looked out over the backyard. She'd had that for 2 years, and then the boarding house owner had died, and his son had come from Cincinnati to settle the estate. And the son had looked at Clara and looked at the books and decided that he wanted someone cheaper or slimmer or both. He hadn't said either thing directly. He'd said the business was changing direction. She'd nodded and packed her bag. The woman who'd mentioned the valley had been a traveler passing through, stopping at the boarding house for 2 nights before continuing west. She'd said the hill country was desperate for people who could work, that the ranches were struggling and half of them couldn't keep skilled help, that someone who knew accounts and cooking could find a place. She'd said it with the particular confidence of someone who hadn't been there recently. Claire had $8.23 in her pocket by the time she left Abilene, and the money had gone in the usual directions: food, brief shelter, passage. And now she had 8 cents and a bleeding hand, and a man she'd known for 10 minutes had offered her a job. She'd had worse. The wagon ride to the Mercer Ranch took closer to 40 minutes than 3 miles should have required, because one of the wheels had developed a wobble that Silas watched with visible concern for the entire trip. He drove and didn't talk much, which Clara found preferable to the alternative. She watched the country instead: the dry hills, the creek beds with their white cracked floors, the cattle she could see on distant rises, standing in the shade of the few trees that still had enough leaves to provide any. The cattle looked thin. Everything looked thin. "How bad is the drought?" she asked at one point. "The worst I've seen. 3rd dry year in a row. This one especially." He didn't embellish. "How are you managing water?" He glanced at her sideways. "We've still got the main well and a stock tank that's down to maybe 30%. We're rationing." He paused. "Why?" "Just trying to understand what I'm walking into. It's not a comfortable situation. I didn't ask for comfortable." They didn't say much after that. The Mercer Ranch was not beautiful. It had been, maybe at some point. There were signs of it in the bones of the place. The generous width of the main house, the way the barn was positioned to catch the morning light, the old oak trees that stood in a rough line along the approach road. But 2 years of drought and an understaffed operation had stripped it down to functionality. The fencing was maintained, but not more than that. The yard between the barn and the house was bare dirt. The garden that ran along the south side of the house had gone to dry stalks and dust. 4 men came out of the barn when the wagon pulled up. They looked at Silas, then at Clara, then at Silas again, in the way men do when they're waiting to understand what interpretation is being offered before they settle on one of their own. "This is Clara Whitmore," Silas said, climbing down from the wagon. "She'll be managing the kitchen and the accounts. Treat her accordingly." One of the men, a broad, sun-darkened man with a beard going gray at the edges, gave Clara a look that wasn't hostile exactly, but wasn't welcoming. "We had accounts before," he said to Silas. "They were a mess." "Which is why we need someone who knows what they're doing," Silas said. The man turned and looked at Clara with a more direct form of assessment. "You know accounts?" "I do." "You know cooking?" "I do." "Can you do both at once? Because what we've had is people who can do one or the other, but not both. And we don't have room for someone who can only do one thing right now." "Tom," Silas said with a warning in it, "I'm asking a practical question." "It's a fair question," Claire said. "And yes, I can do both." Tom looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once and turned back toward the barn. The others followed. Whatever that was, it was apparently its own form of provisional acceptance. The kitchen was a disaster. Not dirty. Whoever had been doing the cooking before had at least kept the surfaces wiped down. But disorganized in the way that happens when a space has been managed by people who don't think in systems. The dry goods were scattered across 3 shelves with no apparent logic: the flour and the cornmeal in the wrong order, the coffee near the lard. The cookware was hung by whoever had last used it, not by function or frequency. The firebox in the stove had a half brick in it that was cracking and would need to be replaced before it broke off entirely and damaged the flue. Clara stood in the kitchen for about 10 minutes that first evening, not touching anything, just looking, building the map of it. Then she started moving things. She worked until the light was gone. The men came in for supper at 6 and found beans and cornbread, the most she could do on a first night with whatever was at hand, but the cornbread came out properly, brown on the bottom and light inside, and the beans had been seasoned with the dried peppers she'd found in the back of a shelf and the heel end of a salt pork she'd located in the cold box. Not remarkable food, but hot, and she was watching while they ate, watching what they ate first, watching what they left, watching what they reached for. Tom ate everything and said nothing. One of the younger hands, a slight kid named Eddie, who couldn't have been more than 19, looked up after the cornbread and said, "This is better than what we had before." "Finish your beans," Tom told him. "I'm just saying, finish your beans." Eddie finished his beans. After supper, Silas showed Clara to the room she'd be using, a small room off the kitchen, which had been a storeroom at some point and still smelled faintly of old onions. There was a cot, a washstand, a small mirror, and a hook on the wall. He handed her a bar of soap and a clean towel. "It's not much," he said. "It has walls and a roof," she said. "I'll manage." He nodded, started to leave, then stopped. "The books are in the office, off the main room. I'll show you in the morning. They're not in good shape." "How not in good shape?" He seemed to consider how to answer this. "The last person I had keeping them knew what he was doing, up to a point. He kept them through 68, 69. After that, he moved on, and I've been doing them myself." "And you're not—" "I'm a rancher," he said. "I know cattle and land and weather, numbers on paper." He stopped. "I've kept track of what I could, but I can't tell you if what I've got written down is right." Clara thought about that. "Have you had money going missing, or just discrepancies you couldn't explain?" Something shifted in his expression. Careful, this time. "There have been some things I couldn't account for. I assumed it was my own mistakes." "Maybe," Clara said. "We'll see." She was up before 4 the next morning. It wasn't discipline exactly. It was that she'd slept badly in the strange room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night. Cattle in the distance, the barn settling, some animal moving through the brush near the creek. And by 3:30 she'd given up on sleep and lay there turning the kitchen inventory she'd done in her head, cataloging what she'd need and what was available and what the gaps were. By 4 she had the fire in the stove going. By 5:30 she had breakfast ready. Biscuits from scratch, salt pork fried properly with enough fat rendered to flavor the pan, and a pot of cornmeal mush that she'd seasoned with a pinch of the dried sage she'd found in the corner of a shelf that had been hidden behind a cracked tin of baking powder. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was consistent and it was plentiful and it was hot. The men came in at 6 and 8. Tom didn't say anything during the meal, but when he was done, he refilled his coffee from the pot on the stove, so, without being asked, without making a point of it, and Clara noticed that he'd eaten everything on his plate and then used the end of his biscuit to clean the rest of the mush from the bowl. That meant she'd gotten the salt right. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Silas showed her the books after breakfast. He brought them out to the kitchen table, 2 thick ledgers and a collection of loose papers that had been bundled with twine, and set them down in front of her with the expression of a man showing someone a wound. The ledgers were heavy and old, the covers worn through at the corners, the pages swollen with humidity at the edges. Clara opened the first one. She spent the next 4 hours going through them. The books through 1869 were clean. Precise columns, regular notations, the handwriting small and consistent. Someone who had actually known what they were doing. After 1869, the handwriting changed. Silas's, she assumed, rounder and less regular, clearly the work of someone who was recording things as best he could without being sure he was doing it right. There were entries missing. There were months where the cattle numbers didn't add up to the previous month's count, with no notation explaining the difference. There were expenditure records that had no corresponding receipts. But that was not the thing that made her stop. Midway through the second ledger, in a section from 1871, she found a series of entries that made her read them twice, then a third time. Water rights payments, small amounts, recurring monthly, made out to something called the Valley Land and Water Association, which she'd never heard of. The amounts were consistent, too consistent, she thought. The same figure, month after month, like a subscription. There were no receipts. No contract noted anywhere, just the payments, repeating, and a notation in Silas's handwriting, per arrangement. She turned back through the earlier section of the ledger, looking for where the payments had started. They began in 1869, which meant they'd been initiated in the last months of the previous bookkeeper and then continued forward without explanation. "Silas?" she said. He was across the room, at the desk, going through some papers of his own. He looked up. "These water rights payments, what's the Valley Land and Water Association?" He was quiet for a moment. "It's an organization that manages the water rights in this part of the valley. Most ranchers here pay into it." "For what exactly?" "For access to the river water." The creek that feeds this ranch originates north of here, up in the hills. The association manages the rights to it. Who runs the association? Another pause, longer this time. Damien Crow. Clara looked at the ledger, then back at Silas. You've been paying him monthly since 1869. I have a legal right to the water. Do you have documentation of that right? Silas opened his mouth, closed it. There should be something in the land files. Show me the land files. Plus, the land files were in a tin box in the back of the office closet. They contained the original deed for the property, a survey from 1861, some correspondence from the previous owner, and a series of documents that had been folded and refolded many times. Clara went through all of it on the kitchen table that afternoon, with the light coming through the window at a low angle. The original deed was in order. The survey was old but detailed. The correspondence was mostly irrelevant. Matters of the previous sale, some boundary clarifications. But the water rights documentation was not there. There should be a water rights grant, Clara said. Either from the state land office or from whatever treaty or agreement governed this area when it was settled. It would have come with the deed. It's not there? It's not there. Silas stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table covered in papers and didn't say anything for a moment. I've been paying Crow for 7 years. Do you know if the other ranchers have documentation for their water rights? I don't know. We don't... He paused. People here don't talk much about what they have or don't have. Crow's been the one managing the association. Everyone just pays. Does anyone not pay? Silas's expression shifted into something complicated. The ones who stopped paying lost access. 2 ranches in the southern part of the valley had their creek access cut off last spring. They sold out inside of 6 months. To Crow? To Crow. Clara sat back in her chair and looked at the survey map she'd spread out on one side of the table. It was old, from 1861, and not detailed in the way a more recent survey would be. But there was a river marked on it, a river that ran along the eastern edge of the valley before joining the creek system that fed most of the ranches. And the course of that river on the 1861 map did not match what she knew of the current geography. She studied the map and didn't say anything for a while. Clara, Silas said. I need to look at more maps, she said, and I need to know if there are older records anywhere, land office records, original survey documents from before 1861, anything that shows what the water situation in this valley looked like before the current arrangement. Why? She looked up at him. Because I think those water payments you've been making might not be for a right that Crow actually has the authority to sell. The room was quiet. Through the kitchen window, she could hear one of the hands moving around in the yard, the distant complaint of cattle. That's a serious claim, Silas said carefully. I know it is. That's why I need more information before I say anything more about it. She turned back to the survey map. This is just a shape at this point. It might be nothing, but I want to know. Silas was quiet for a moment. The land office in Red Hollow might have older records. They've been there since 63, 64. Can you take me to town this week? I can take you tomorrow. Good. She began folding the survey map carefully along its original creases. I'm also going to need to make some changes to the kitchen account system. The current method isn't tracking waste accurately, which means you can't see where money is going. I'll need a week to set up something better. Silas looked at the table, then at her. You found all that in one day? I found a place to start, she said. That's all it is. It was a week before the crew began to treat her as something other than a temporary inconvenience. The process was not smooth or quick or particularly kind. Tom was consistently polite, but maintained the measured reserve of a man who'd seen plenty of things come and go at this ranch and had learned not to invest in any of them prematurely. The youngest hand, Eddie, was friendly in a puppy-like way that didn't require much from her, and she found him easy to tolerate because he didn't perform anything. He just said what he thought, which was refreshing. The other two, a quiet man named Garfield and a hand of about 30 named Pete, who had a bad shoulder and a habit of chewing on a piece of straw when he was thinking, watched her with the neutrality of men waiting to be given a reason to change their mind. What changed their minds in the end was not the cooking, though the cooking helped. It was the evening of the 6th day, when Clara came into the main room after supper and put a sheet of paper on the table in front of Silas. "You've been overcharged at the general store," she said. "Going back at least 14 months, maybe further. Someone there has been rounding up on the supply orders. Not by much on any individual item, but it adds up. Over the past year, I estimate you've paid approximately $43 more than you should have." Silas stared at the paper. The numbers were laid out simply, side by side. What the ledger showed paid, what the standard market prices from Clara's own records suggested should have been paid, and the difference. Tom, who was sitting near the stove, leaned over to look at the paper without being invited. He was quiet for a long moment. "That's a lot of money," Garfield said from across the room. "It is," Clara said. "What do we do about it?" Silas asked. "That's up to you. You could go to the storekeeper and ask for an accounting. You could start keeping your own price records and purchasing elsewhere when the difference is more than a certain percentage. Or you could do both." She paused. "I'd suggest the latter." Tom was still looking at the paper. "How'd you find this?" "I compared the ledger entries against the current prices listed in the supply catalogs I found in the desk, and then cross-referenced against what we actually received. It took time." "You've been here 6 days." "I've been working early mornings." He looked at her, and something in his face reorganized, not warmth exactly, but something that was no longer distance. "All right," he said, which was not a response to anything she'd said specifically, but felt like one anyway. On the 8th day, Clara went to the land office in Red Hollow. The land office was a single room in a building that also housed a telegraph office, run by a clerk named Henderson, who was approximately 60 years old and had the dusty precision of a man who had spent decades handling documents. He was polite in a formal, professional way, and asked no questions about why she wanted to see the older survey records, for which she was grateful. The records went back to 1854. She was there for most of the day. What she found was not conclusive, not yet, but it was enough to make her hands feel slightly unsteady on the drive back to the ranch, and enough to keep her awake that night long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, lying on the cot in the room that still smelled faintly of onions, staring at the ceiling and turning the numbers over in her mind. The river on the 1861 survey was in the same place as on the 1854 survey. That meant the river had been where it was before the current arrangement had come into being. But in a land office document from 1867, a permit granted to something called the Valley Improvement Company, which had later become the Valley Land and Water Association, there was a reference to a modified watercourse and engineering works completed in the spring of 1866. Engineering works. A modified watercourse. She'd need to find the old riverbed to know for certain, but if the river had been moved, if someone had physically diverted it in 1866, and then claimed ownership of the new route, granting or selling water rights to that diverted water, then the original course, wherever it ran, might still carry legal weight, and the ranchers who'd been paying for access to the diverted water might have a right to the original that no one had ever charged them for, because no one was supposed to know it existed. She thought about the dried creek beds she'd seen on the drive into Red Hollow. She thought about the eastern edge of the valley where the old maps showed a river. She thought about what a man like Damien Crowe would do if he knew someone was looking at those old maps. She lay on the cot and thought about it for a long time. Outside, the Texas night was dry and still, and somewhere in the hills something made a sound that might have been a coyote, might have been the wind moving through the dead grass. And Clara Whitmore, who had walked into Red Hollow 8 days ago with 8 cents in her pocket and been laughed at in the street, pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and made herself breathe slowly, and thought, not yet. Not yet. First, I need to be sure. She closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come for a while, but eventually it did. Tomorrow she'd start on the next set of records. She had work to do. The second week was harder than the first. Not because of the work. The work was the only thing that felt reliable. It was everything around the work that had gotten complicated. Clara had found something in those land office records, and she hadn't told Silas the full weight of it yet, because she wasn't sure enough, and because she understood, with a precision that came from watching powerful people for most of her life, that half a truth delivered too early was more dangerous than no truth at all. So she kept it folded inside her, alongside everything else she kept folded inside her, and she went back to the kitchen in the mornings, and she went back to the ledgers in the evenings, and she said nothing about rivers. What she did instead was cook. Not in a showy way, not in the way of someone trying to prove something through food, which she'd seen done and found embarrassing to watch. She cooked the way she'd always cooked, which was attentively, paying attention to what the men needed from the food, not what she wanted to give them. They were doing physical work in brutal heat. That meant salt and fat and substance. It meant coffee strong enough to do something. It meant biscuits that held together when you were eating them fast in a saddlebag, not the delicate kind that crumbled on contact. She learned their preferences without asking directly, which she'd found was a faster method than asking. Tom liked his eggs cooked hard, which she noticed on day 3. Eddie would eat anything, but always went back for more of whatever had the most pepper. Garfield had a bad tooth on his left side and avoided anything he had to chew hard on the left, which she figured out by watching which side of his mouth he favored. Pete ate slowly and methodically, cleaning his plate in neat sections, and he always looked slightly relieved when there was enough, which made her think there had been periods in his life when there wasn't. She adjusted accordingly. She didn't announce the adjustments. By the end of the second week, Tom had started leaving the chairs at the kitchen table pushed in when he left, instead of abandoned. It was the kind of small voluntary order that men perform when they've decided a space belongs to someone who deserves it. Clara noticed and said nothing about it. What she did say, on the Thursday of that second week, was, "We're wasting money on the flour order." Silas looked up from the harness he was working on at the other end of the table. They'd fallen into a habit of working in the same room in the evenings, him at one end and her at the other, without having agreed to it. "What do you mean?" "We're ordering every 2 weeks, but the way we're using it, we'd be better off ordering once a month in a larger quantity. The price per pound is lower if you buy in 50-pound sacks instead of 25, and Henderson at the general store." She stopped. "Not Henderson. The other supplier, in Millbrook. He sells at better rates than the Red Hollow store, and his quality is the same." Silas set down the harness. "That's a 20-mile trip. Once a month instead of twice. It costs less in time overall, and we'd save approximately $6 a month on the difference in pricing, which over a year is $72. $74 if you factor in the dry goods we'd also be moving, coffee, cornmeal, the lard." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this." "It's my job to think about this." He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read. Silas Mercer did not have a wide range of visible expressions, which made each one matter more. This one was something like recalibration, like he was adjusting the picture he'd been working with. "All right," he said, "we'll do the Millbrook run next month." "The first of the month," she said, "so the schedule is regular and we can plan around it." "The first of the month," he agreed. She went back to the ledger. He went back to the harness. The lamp between them burned low. The change in the crew's attitude didn't happen in a moment. It accumulated the way most real things accumulate, in small deposits, over time, without anyone calling attention to it. It was Eddie finding her in the kitchen one afternoon and asking, with considerable awkwardness, whether she'd looked at the record for the eastern pasture fencing because he thought there might be a discrepancy in the wire count. She had looked at it. There was a discrepancy. She showed him where it was and how to read the notation, and he stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at the ledger page with more concentration than she'd expected from him, asking questions that were specific and not stupid. It was Garfield, the quiet one, stopping in the kitchen doorway one morning when she was adjusting the firebox brick with a pair of tongs. She'd been meaning to do it for a week and had finally run out of patience, and saying, without preamble, "You need to angle it the other direction or it'll crack again." She'd angled it the other direction. He'd nodded once and gone back to whatever he was doing. It was Pete, on a Sunday afternoon when there was a brief cease in the week's labor, finding her on the porch working through the older set of records she'd brought from the office. He sat down on the step without asking and looked out at the yard for a while, then said, "You've been at those books every evening since you got here?" "Yes." "What are you looking for?" She considered how to answer. "I'm trying to understand the ranch's history, where the money has gone, what the patterns are." He nodded. "You find anything interesting?" "I find things I have questions about." "That an answer?" "That's all the answer I have right now." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, Before Silas, this land belonged to a family called Holt. They were here from the early days. They sold out in '68, moved east. Clara kept her eyes on the ledger. Do you know why they sold? Drought that year, same as now. Plus, he paused. There was some trouble with water access. They'd had a disagreement with Crow about payments, and then that summer the creek running through their north pasture ran dry. Never did figure out why. Had it run dry before? Not in anyone's memory. He picked up the piece of straw he'd set on the step and put it in the corner of his mouth. Could have been the drought. Could have been, Clara said. He looked at her. She was still looking at the ledger. He looked away again. I'm just telling you what I know, he said. I appreciate it. He nodded, got up, and went back inside. Clara sat with the ledger in her lap and the piece about the Holt family settling somewhere in her chest, and she thought about the creek running through the north pasture and what it might mean that it had run dry in the same year the Holts had had a dispute about water payments, and she thought about the modified watercourse from the land office document, and she kept thinking about it until the sun went low enough that she couldn't read anymore. 3 weeks in, she found the accounting mistake that changed everything. It was buried, not obviously, not in the way of something that had been deliberately hidden, though she couldn't rule that out, but in the kind of layers that accumulate when accounts have been kept imperfectly by someone who didn't know quite what they were doing. There was an expenditure line from 1872 for equipment repair, a significant sum that had been recorded twice, not because Silas had paid it twice, as far as Clara could tell, but because it had been entered once in the wrong column and then entered again in the correct column without the first entry being crossed out. The result was that the 1872 accounts showed the ranch had spent approximately $220 more than it actually had. $220 in 1872 would have looked, on paper, like a very bad year. And a bad year on paper could affect a great many things. Decisions about loans, about expansion, about whether to hold or sell. More pressingly, it would have affected Silas's own sense of where the ranch stood, the internal accounting he did in his head, the confidence with which he made decisions. She sat with the corrected numbers for a long time before she brought them to him. You're not as far in the hole as you thought, she said, and put the 2 sets of figures in front of him. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked up at her. You're certain? I checked it 4 times. There are still years where I can't fully reconcile the numbers because the records before 1869 have some gaps. But from 1869 forward, if I'm reading this right, you've been operating on a more stable foundation than you believed. Not comfortable, but more stable. By $200. $222. He sat back in his chair. Something moved through his face that she wouldn't have been able to name exactly. It wasn't relief, or not only that. It was the particular expression of a man who had been carrying a weight that he'd thought was 50 pounds, and has just been told it's 35. The weight is still there, but something shifts. I thought we were close to the edge, he said quietly. You're not as close as you thought. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What made you look there? The 1872 total looked wrong. The ratio of expenditure to output was off compared to the surrounding years. Not by much, but enough that it stood out when you put them side by side. I wouldn't have seen that. You're not trained to see it. He looked at her, and this time the expression was more readable. Thank you, Clara. She nodded. She started to gather up the papers and then stopped, because there was something else she'd been turning over for days, and she'd decided, sitting here, that this was the moment to say part of it. Not all of it, but part. Silas, those water rights payments, to the association. He went still. I'd like to look into them more carefully, not just the payment records, but the underlying documentation. I want to see what exactly Crow's organization holds, and whether it's been properly filed with the state. Clara. His voice was careful. Damien Crow is not someone who... I know who he is. I don't think you do. Not fully. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. He owns the Whitfield Bank in Red Hollow, which means he holds paper on half the ranches in the valley. He has an arrangement with the county judge, which is not something I can prove, but which everyone understands. When the 2 ranches in the south couldn't pay their water fees, it wasn't just the creek that went dry. It was that Crow's bank called in their loans inside of 3 weeks. Both families were gone by summer. Clara absorbed this. How many ranches are paying into the association? 11 that I know of. There might be more. And all of them are in the same position you are, paying monthly with no documentation of what they're actually paying for. I have documentation. A payment record is not documentation of a legal right. It's documentation that you paid. She watched his face. If the water rights Crow is selling were acquired improperly, every ranch in this valley has been paying for something that was never his to sell. The room was very quiet. Outside, the summer dusk was coming on, and somewhere out in the dry pasture, a cow was making a low, unhappy sound. You found something, Silas said. Not a question. I found the beginning of something. I need more before I know what it is. What do you need? The older land office records going back to the original territorial surveys, and I'd like to see the eastern edge of the valley, the area near the old county line. I want to look at the terrain. He was looking at her steadily. That's a full day's ride. I know. If Crow finds out someone is asking questions, then we make sure he doesn't find out. Not yet. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking you to do anything yet. I'm asking you to let me keep looking. Silas Mercer sat across from her in the lamplight and looked at the corrected ledger figures she'd laid in front of him and looked at her, and Clara held herself still and waited. She'd learned in the weeks since she'd arrived that he was not a man who made fast decisions about important things. He thought slowly and moved deliberately, and she'd found that she trusted that about him more than she'd have trusted quickness. All right, he said finally. Keep looking. I'll need you to take me to town again. And I'll need access to everything in the land files, anything you have from the previous owner, anything that came with the original deed. I'll get it out tonight. She nodded. She picked up the corrected ledger and started toward the office, and then she stopped in the doorway because there was one more thing, and she'd been deciding all evening whether to say it. Silas. He looked up. The people who sold out to Crow these past few years, do you know any of them? Do you know where they went? He was quiet for a moment. Some of them. Why? Because if this goes where I think it might go, the families who lost their land because of fraudulent water rights, they have a claim too, not just the ranches still operating. She paused. It would help to know who they are and whether they kept any records. Silas stared at her. That's a very large thing you're describing, he said slowly. I know. If you're wrong, I know. And if you're right, and Crow finds out what we're doing before we have enough to, I know, she said for the third time. That's why I'm being careful. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the cow had stopped its complaining, and the evening had gone quiet in the particular way the drought-dry valley went quiet when the wind dropped. Not peaceful exactly, but empty, like something waiting. The Greer family, Silas said at last. They sold their ranch in '72. Franklin Greer was meticulous about his records. His wife even more so. They moved to a town about 40 miles east. Last I heard, they were still there. Would they talk to you? Franklin Greer was a friend of mine. Then we should go see him, Clara said, after I've had a bit more time with the documents. Silas nodded. He looked down at the table, then back at her. You came in here 3 weeks ago with 8 cents in your pocket, he said, and you're about to go to war with the most powerful man in the county. Clara considered that. I'm not going to war with anyone, she said. I'm going to find out what's true. After that, the truth can do whatever it wants. She went into the office and left him sitting in the lamplight, and behind her she heard him exhale slowly. Not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh, something in between, and then the sound of him getting up to retrieve the land files from the closet. Outside, the dry valley waited. Somewhere to the east, past the hills and the cracked creek beds, there was a river that wasn't where it was supposed to be. And somewhere in Red Hollow, a man named Damian Crow was going about his evening with no knowledge that a woman who'd walked into town 3 weeks ago with nothing was sitting with his ledgers. Not yet. Franklin Greer was a small man who had gotten smaller. That was Clara's first impression when Silas pulled the wagon up to the modest house on the eastern edge of Caldwell. Not a ranch anymore, just a house with a narrow yard and a kitchen garden that showed the careful attention of people who were used to tending larger things and had redirected that energy somewhere It could still do some good. Franklin Greer came out to meet them with the slightly stunned expression of a man who had stopped expecting visitors. And behind him came his wife Margaret, wiping her hands on her apron, watching Clara with the particular attention of a woman who made fast and accurate assessments of strangers. Silas had sent a letter ahead. Franklin had written back in 3 days, which told Clara something about how much he'd been waiting for someone to ask. They sat in the kitchen, which was neat and small and smelled of something baking. Margaret put coffee on without asking and sat down at the table with them, which Clara noted. She was not the kind of woman who removed herself to another room when the conversation turned serious. "You said you had questions about the water," Franklin said, looking at Silas. "Clara has questions," Silas said. "I'm here because I should have asked them myself years ago." Franklin looked at Clara then, with the measured look of a man recalculating. "You're working for Silas?" "I manage his accounts and his kitchen," Clara said. "Among other things." "She found discrepancies," Silas said, "in the payment records to the association and in the land office files." Franklin was quiet for a moment. Margaret set down 3 cups and sat with her own. "What kind of discrepancies?" Franklin asked. "The kind that suggests the water rights Crow has been selling may not have been his to sell," Clara said. She kept her voice even. She'd rehearsed how much to say and decided on all of it, because Franklin Greer was not a man she was going to get a second conversation with, and half information would produce half cooperation. In the 1854 and 1861 surveys, the river in the Eastern Valley ran a different course than it does now. There's a permit from 1867 referencing engineering works and a modified watercourse. If someone physically moved that river in 1866 and then claimed ownership of the new route, the original course still carries legal weight. And every rancher paying for access to the diverted water may have a prior claim they never knew existed. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Franklin looked at his wife. Margaret looked at him. Something passed between them that Clara couldn't read but recognized. The look of 2 people who have had a version of the same conversation many times and are now watching it arrive in a different form. "We kept everything," Margaret said. She wasn't looking at her husband anymore. She was looking at Clara. "When we sold and moved here, I kept every document we had, every payment receipt, every piece of correspondence with the association, every survey or map that came with the property. Franklin thought I was being stubborn." "You were being stubborn," Franklin said, but not unkindly. "I was being right." She stood up from the table. "Give me a few minutes." She came back with a wooden box that had a latch on it, the kind of box that had been opened and closed carefully many times. She set it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside, neatly folded and separated by thin pieces of cloth to prevent the paper from sticking together, were documents going back to the original purchase of their land. Clara spent 2 hours at that kitchen table. What she found in the Greer's box confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. There was a letter in the correspondence from 1865, 1 year before the engineering works referenced in the permit, in which a representative of something called the Valley Improvement Company offered to purchase a right-of-way across the Greer land for the purpose of irrigation channel management. Franklin's father, who had owned the land at the time, had declined. The letter offering purchase was polite. A follow-up letter, 3 months later, was less so. After that, there was no more correspondence from the Valley Improvement Company. But there was a note in Franklin's father's own handwriting, tucked between 2 other documents, that said simply, "River changed course this spring. Don't know how." Clara looked at the note for a long time. Then she looked at Margaret. "Would you be willing to let me take copies of these documents? Not the originals. I'd want you to keep the originals somewhere safe." "What are you going to do with them?" Margaret asked. "I'm going to find the old riverbed," Clara said, "and if it's where I think it is, I'm going to document it before anyone can interfere. And then I'm going to find a lawyer." Margaret looked at her husband. Franklin Greer had gone very still. He was looking at the table, at the open wooden box and the papers spread across it, and his expression was the complicated one of a man who had made peace with something, and was now being asked to unmake that peace. "We lost that land," he said quietly. "We lost 11 years of work." "I know. If you're right about this, I might not be. I want to be honest with you about that. The physical evidence could have been destroyed. The original riverbed could be too altered to document. The courts might not..." She stopped. There are a lot of ways this could not work, but what I know with certainty is that if no one looks, it definitely doesn't work. Franklin was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and closed the lid of the box and pushed it gently across the table toward Clara. Take what you need, he said. That. It took another 2 weeks of careful work before Clara was ready to go look for the riverbed. She'd spent those weeks cross-referencing the Greer documents with the land office records she'd already copied, building a picture of the valley's original water geography as precisely as she could from documentary evidence alone. The old survey maps, overlaid mentally against what she knew of the current terrain, suggested the original river course had run through a low depression on the eastern edge of the valley, an area that was now dry grassland on the boundary between two properties, neither of which belonged to Crow directly, though one of them had recently been acquired by a buyer whose name Clara had seen in one of Crow's correspondence records copied at the land office. She hadn't told the crew what she was doing. She'd told Silas, in pieces, and he'd listened to each piece with the same careful stillness he'd listened with since the beginning. By the time she laid out the full picture for him on an evening in late August, the drought had tightened another notch, and 3 more ranches in the valley had received letters from the association with language about adjusted fee structures that amounted, as Clara read it, to a significant increase in payments at exactly the moment most of the ranchers were least equipped to pay. Silas read the letter a neighboring rancher named Aldous had brought over, read it twice, and set it down. He's accelerating. He is, Clara said. Either he knows something is happening or he's taking advantage of the drought to push people out faster. Either way, we don't have as much time as I thought we had. How soon do you need to go to the riverbed? This week, before the weather changes and before anyone decides to disturb that area. He looked at her. I'll come with you. I was counting on that. Tom should come too, and Pete. If there's something to document, we need more than 2 people who can testify to what we found. She'd already been thinking the same thing. Can you trust them to be quiet about it? I can trust them, he said, without hesitation, which was itself a piece of information. Silas Mercer did not say things like that loosely. They went on a Wednesday, leaving before 4 in the morning to be at the location by first light. Claire had the survey maps folded in her coat pocket and a notebook and 2 pencils. Tom drove the wagon with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been told only that they were going to look at terrain and had decided that was sufficient information for now. Pete sat in the back with Clara, both of them watching the dark landscape come gradually lighter as they drove east. They found it 3 miles past the county line marker. The depression was exactly where the oldest survey suggested it would be. A long, shallow channel running roughly north to south through a stretch of ground that was lower than the surrounding land, banked on either side by a slight ridge that was barely perceptible from a distance, but unmistakable when you were standing in it. The channel was dry, had been dry for years. The vegetation in it was scrub and dead grass, same as everything else, but the shape of it was wrong for natural formation. The banks were too even. The channel floor had a particular smoothness under the cracked surface that was different from the surrounding ground. Tom crouched down and dug a small hole in the channel floor with his knife. About 8 inches down, the soil changed color and texture, darker, with the dampness of ground that had once carried regular water. Well, he said, and didn't say anything else for a moment. Then, that's a riverbed. That's a riverbed, Claire confirmed. She spent the next 2 hours documenting. She sketched the channel from multiple vantage points, noting dimensions, width, depth of the banks, the direction of flow indicated by the slight grade of the floor. She recorded the landmarks, 2 distinctive rock formations on the eastern bank, a cluster of old cottonwood trees whose root systems had clearly once reached water. She noted the GPS of vegetation changes along the banks. She recorded everything in the notebook in her careful, precise handwriting, and Pete held the notebook while she sketched, and Tom and Silas took measurements with the rope they'd brought and confirmed her estimates. It was Pete who heard the horses first. He said, quietly, "Clara," in a tone that made her stop writing. 3 riders coming from the south, still a quarter-mile out but moving at a pace that wasn't casual. Clara folded the notebook into her coat pocket without being told and looked at Silas. "Do you know them?" He was looking at the riders. His face had gone careful. The one in front is Vance Hollis. He works for Crow. All three of them? Probably. Tom had stood up from where he'd been crouching over his measurements. He was not a dramatic man, but Clara noticed, not for the first time, that when he stood to his full height, he occupied more space than he did otherwise. The riders pulled up about 30 feet away. The one in front, Hollis, a broad man with a reddish beard and the particular stillness of someone who was comfortable with confrontation, looked at the four of them and then looked at the ground they were standing in, and something moved through his expression that he controlled quickly. "Mercer," he said. "Hollis," Silas said. "This is private land." "No, it isn't. This strip runs along the county boundary. It's unplatted government land." Hollis looked at Clara, then at the notebook-shaped outline in her coat pocket. "What are you people doing out here?" "Surveying," Silas said. "For what purpose?" "That's my business." The three riders were quiet for a moment. One of the horses shifted and blew out breath. Hollis looked at Clara again, longer this time. She met his eyes and didn't look away, which she'd found was usually the right choice with men who were testing whether you'd flinch. "Mr. Crow owns the water rights in this valley," Hollis said, and now he was talking to Clara directly, which meant he'd identified her as the relevant party. "He takes a serious interest in any activity that might affect those rights." "Mr. Crow owns what he can demonstrate legal title to," Clara said. "Same as everyone else." Hollis's jaw tightened. "I'd be careful about what claims you go making, ma'am." "That's good advice for everyone," she said. It was the wrong thing to say, in the sense that it was exactly the right thing to say. It drew a line without crossing into anything that could be characterized as a threat, and it did so in a tone that was perfectly level, which she'd found was more unsettling to people like Hollis than anger would have been. Anger they knew how to handle, calm they didn't. Hollis looked at Silas. "This is a mistake you're making." "Noted," Silas said. The three riders sat there for another moment. Then Hollis turned his horse, and they rode back the way they'd come, not hurrying, making a point of not hurrying. Tom watched them go. "He'll be in Red Hollow by nightfall." "I know," Silas said. He looked at Clara. "Did you get enough?" "Almost." She pulled the notebook back out. "Give me 20 more minutes." Clara, 20 minutes. She was already measuring the width of the cottonwood root system at the bank. "We came here to document this. I'm going to document it." He watched her for a moment. Then he nodded. Tom and Pete positioned themselves where they could see in both directions, not formally, just naturally, the way men do when they've decided something needs watching, and Clara worked for 19 more minutes in the dry channel while the August sun came up fully overhead and turned the valley white with heat. What she had, when she finally closed the notebook, was not proof. Not yet. Proof would require a lawyer who understood water rights law, a judge who wasn't in Crow's pocket, and a presentation of evidence that could survive the kind of attack that Crow's money could mount. What she had was documentation. A specific, detailed, witnessed record of a physical feature of the land that was consistent with what the oldest surveys showed and inconsistent with what Crow's arrangement claimed. It was enough to begin. On the drive back, no one talked much. The heat was serious by mid-morning, and the horses needed attention. Silas drove with the same careful focus he applied to everything, and Clara sat beside him on the bench and went through the notebook in her lap, adding notes while the details were still fresh. At one point he said, without looking away from the road, "Hollis will tell Crow what he saw." "Yes. Crow will know we're asking questions. He'll know someone is asking questions about the Eastern Valley. He doesn't know yet what we found or what we have from the Greers. It's only a matter of time before he does. Which means we need to move faster than I'd planned." She closed the notebook. "I need a lawyer, Silas, not someone local. Someone from Austin or San Antonio who handles land and water cases and who isn't connected to anything in this county." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I know a man in San Antonio. He helped settle a boundary dispute for a friend of mine about 5 years back. He's not cheap." "How not cheap?" "More than we have on hand." Clara thought about the corrected ledger figures, the $222 that had been a phantom debt. What if we had other ranchers sharing the cost? If the case involves water rights for the whole valley, they'd have to be willing. And right now, most of them are scared. They're scared because they think they're alone. She looked at the road ahead. What happens when they find out they're not? Silas didn't answer immediately. The wagon moved through the heat, through the dry landscape, past the cracked creek beds and the thin cattle on the burnt hills. And after a while he said, I can talk to Aldous, and maybe the Packard brothers north of here. They've been paying the association longer than anyone. Would they listen? If I tell them what you told me, yes, they'd listen. He paused. Whether they'd act is a different question. That's always the different question, Clara said. They came back into the ranch yard a little before noon. The hands were coming in from the morning work, faces red from the heat, and as Clara climbed down from the wagon with her notebook and the folded maps under her arm, Eddie fell into step beside her toward the kitchen and said, in his uncomplicated way, You find what you were looking for? Clara looked at him. Most of it. Good, he said, like that settled it, and held the kitchen door open for her. That night, after supper, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table long after the lamp should have been turned down and went through the notebook one more time. The cottonwood trees, the changed soil at 8 inches, the 2 even banks of the channel, Hollis's face when he'd looked at the ground and understood what they were standing in. Somewhere in Red Hollow, Crow now knew someone was looking. She didn't know yet what he would do with that knowledge, but she had lived long enough to know that powerful men who felt threatened did not wait to respond. She had to be ready before he was. She closed the notebook and pressed her palm flat against the cover, the same hand she'd cut on the street in Red Hollow 6 weeks ago, still faintly scarred across the heel. She thought about the Greer family and their small house in Caldwell, with their kitchen garden and their wooden box of documents kept carefully for years against the possibility that someone would come asking. She thought about Pete saying the creek had run dry the same year the Holts had their dispute with Crow and the quiet, terrible math of that. She thought about what it meant to build something and have it taken by a mechanism so quiet and so apparently legal that you couldn't even name clearly what had been done to you. She turned down the lamp and went to bed, and lay in the dark room that still faintly smelled of old onions, and told herself to sleep because tomorrow she had work to do. The lawyer's name was Robert Cass, and he arrived in Red Hollow on a Thursday morning in early September, looking like a man who had made the trip from San Antonio under protest. He was not what Clara had expected. She'd built a picture from Silas's description, competent, experienced, good with land cases, and had imagined someone weathered and direct. What stepped off the stage was a man of about 50 with a neat gray suit that was already losing its battle with the Texas dust, a leather case under his arm, and the kind of careful eyes that took in a room before committing to an expression. He shook Silas's hand and then looked at Clara, and she could see him revising something. You're the one who found the documents, he said. I am. Silas's letters said you'd reconstructed the accounting records from memory, essentially. From original sources, mostly, some reconstruction where records were missing. Cass looked at her for a moment longer. All right, he said, show me everything. They spent 2 days at the ranch, Cass going through everything Clara had assembled, the copied land office records, the Greer documents, the survey overlays she'd drawn by hand comparing the 1854 and 1861 maps against the current terrain, her notebook from the riverbed, and the financial records she'd reconstructed showing 9 years of payments to the association from Silas alone, extrapolated across the 11 ranches she'd identified as current members. Cass was not a man who said much while he worked. He read carefully, asked specific questions, wrote notes in a cramped hand in his own notebook. On the evening of the first day, he sat back from the kitchen table and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Clara. This is a strong case, he said, stronger than I expected. But strong doesn't mean simple. The diversion happened in 1866. That's 8 years ago. Crow's operation has been running long enough to have accumulated the appearance of legitimacy. He has contracts. He has payment records. He has the institutional weight of an organization that has been operating in daylight. He tapped his notebook. What you have is historical evidence and a physical feature of the land. The question is whether a judge will weigh the original survey records against 8 years of established practice. The judge in Red Hollow won't, Silas said from across the table. He'd been quiet for most of the afternoon, but now he was looking at Cass directly. We'd need to file in a different jurisdiction. I've already been thinking about that. There's a federal circuit court that handles water rights cases in this territory. A federal filing removes it from county jurisdiction entirely. Cass paused. It also makes it more expensive and more visible. Crow will have better warning and better resources to respond. He already knows we're asking questions, Clara said. After what happened at the riverbed, we don't have the advantage of surprise anymore. Then we have the advantage of preparation. Cass looked at the papers spread across the table. I'll need original testimony from the Greer family. And if there are any other families who sold out under similar circumstances, their records would strengthen the damages claim. I've identified 3 other families, Clara said. She'd been working on it since Caldwell. 2 of them are still within reasonable distance. 1 moved to Louisiana, which complicates things. Get me the 2 who are close. He looked at her. And I want you to write up a formal summary of the financial reconstruction, what you found in the ledgers, how you identified the discrepancies, what the payment totals represent across all the ranches. In your own words, clearly laid out. That document may end up being presented as evidence. Clara nodded. She'd half-drafted it already. Crow made his first move 10 days before the court date. It came through the bank, which was exactly how Clara had expected it to come. A letter arrived at the ranch informing Silas that his account, a modest line of credit he'd held at Whitfield Bank for 7 years, was being called in for review due to, as the letter phrased it, concerns about the creditworthiness of the collateral property given current market conditions. The amount wasn't ruinous on its own, but the timing was precise, and it wasn't about the money. It was about the message. Silas read the letter and handed it to Clara without comment. She read it twice. He's telling you to stop. I know what he's telling me. What do you want to do? He looked at her steadily. I want to know if we have enough to win. Cass thinks we have a strong case. That's not the same as winning. No, she said. It's not. She set the letter on the table. If we stop now, the bank letter goes away. The association fees go back to normal, or close to it. Nothing changes for anyone. And if we don't stop, then we find out if what we have is enough. She paused. I think it is. I want to be honest with you, so I think it is. But I've been wrong about things before, and I can't promise you certainty. Silas sat with that for a moment. Outside, one of the hands was working in the yard, the rhythmic sound of something being repaired. What would you do? He said. If it were your decision alone. Clara didn't hesitate. I'd go forward. Why? Because the alternative is letting it stand, and I can't let things stand when I know they're wrong. She said it plainly, without drama, because it was simply true and she'd stop dressing simple truths up to make them sound better. That might not be the right answer for you. Your ranch is at risk in a way mine isn't. Your crew depends on this place. That's real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Silas was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the letter on the table. Then he looked at Clara. Write to Cass. Tell him we're proceeding. What happened next happened fast, and not cleanly. Aldous came out to the ranch 3 days later in a state somewhere between agitated and resolved, having received his own bank letter and a visit from Hollis the previous evening that he described as not friendly. He sat at Clara's kitchen table and drank coffee and said, I heard what you found out at the county line. Is it true? It's true, Clara said. And this lawyer you've got, he thinks we have a case? He thinks we have a strong case. Strong enough to beat Crow in court? He's filing in federal circuit court, out of Crow's county jurisdiction. Aldous turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was a rancher of about 60, big through the chest, with white hair and the particular weariness of someone who had been stubborn their whole life and wasn't sure it had paid off. The Packard brothers got a letter too, he said. Same as mine. And Vic Halley, north of them, got a visit from Hollis. How many are still willing to hold? Aldous looked at her. That depends. If we file and lose, Crow will own every bank loan in this valley within 6 months. You understand that? I understand. And if we file and win? The diversion is declared illegal. Water rights revert to the original surveys. The association's authority is void. Every ranch that's been paying since 1866 has a damages claim. She kept her voice level. It doesn't fix everything. It won't give the families who already sold back what they lost, but it stops what's happening now. Aldous was quiet. Then he said, "What do you need from us?" "Testimony, records, and for everyone to hold on to their land until the case is decided," he exhaled. "I'll talk to the Packards tonight. Hallie, I'm less sure about. He's had bad luck this year, and Crow's been leaning on him." He stood up. "You know, when Silas first told me he'd taken on a bookkeeper, I thought—" He stopped. "I know what you thought," Clara said. He had the decency to look slightly ashamed. "I was wrong." "Yes," she said without softening it. "You were." He left, and Clara went back to the document she was writing for Cass, and she wrote for 3 more hours until the lamp needed refilling. The courthouse in this federal district was 2 days' ride, and they made the trip in a group. Silas and Clara in the wagon, Cass riding alongside, and Aldous and the elder Packard brother following in a second wagon with Franklin and Margaret Greer, who had made the trip from Caldwell without being asked twice. Clara had spent the week before the hearing going through her written summary 17 times. Not because she doubted the facts, but because she'd learned from watching how people received information that the order in which you presented things mattered almost as much as the things themselves. She wanted the financial picture first, the concrete numbers, the payment totals, the demonstrated pattern of loss, before the historical evidence, because numbers were harder to argue with than maps. Numbers were specific and cold, and they didn't require anyone to understand land surveying. The courtroom was smaller than she'd imagined and hotter. Crow arrived with 2 lawyers from Austin, both of them dressed better than anyone else in the room, and a stack of documents that his men carried in a wooden crate. He looked at Clara once, when they were both standing in the hall outside before the proceedings began, and his expression was not what she'd expected either. She'd expected contempt. What she saw was something more calculating, the look of a man who was revising his assessment of a situation. He did not speak to her. She did not speak to him. Inside, Crow's lawyers went first. They were good. Clara sat at the table beside Cass and listened and kept her expression neutral and took notes on a piece of paper, not because she needed to, but because having something to do with her hands helped her think. The lawyers argued that the association's water rights were established by contract and practice, that the ranchers had willingly entered into payment agreements, and that whatever historical surveys showed, 8 years of legal operation constituted a legitimate claim. They were persuasive. She could feel the weight of it in the room. Then Cass presented. He was quieter than Crow's lawyers, which was a choice she understood immediately. He spoke at a pace that allowed the judge to follow without effort, laying out the 1854 survey, the 1861 survey, the engineering works permit, the note from Franklin's father's files. He presented Clara's financial summary as an exhibit, walked through the payment totals, and then presented the testimony of the Greer family and the 2 other displaced ranchers whose records Clara had tracked down. But it was what Cass did at the end that Clara hadn't expected. He called her. She'd known she might be asked to testify, but she hadn't known he planned to call her as the primary witness for the financial reconstruction. She walked to the chair beside the judge's bench and sat down, aware of the room in the particular way she'd always been aware of rooms, who was looking at her and how, what the looking meant, how to hold herself inside it. Cass asked her, simply and directly, to explain what she had found in the Mercer Ranch ledgers and what it had led her to discover. She explained. She took 20 minutes. She used no dramatic language. She stated what she'd found, how she'd found it, what she'd done to verify it, and what conclusions the evidence supported. She laid out the payment totals across the 11 ranches over 9 years. She explained the double entry from 1872, how she'd caught it, what it meant. She described the Greer documents, what they contained, how they connected to the land office permit. She did not look at Crow while she spoke. She looked at the judge, because the judge was the only person in the room whose thinking mattered. Crow's lawyers cross-examined for 40 minutes. They challenged her credentials, which she didn't have formally, and she said so directly. She had no formal training, she had experience, and she had done the work. They challenged the survey comparisons, and she explained her methodology, calmly and in detail, acknowledging the limits of what paper evidence could prove about physical geography. They suggested her financial analysis was speculative, and she agreed that some of it was estimated, and then she told them which parts were estimated and which parts were drawn from original documents, and the distinction was unflattering to the suggestion that it was mostly speculation. At one point, one of the lawyers said, with an edge in it, "Miss Whitmore, you arrived in this valley approximately 2 months ago with no established credentials and no formal standing. Why should this court give weight to your analysis over the established records of a licensed financial institution?" Clara looked at him. "Because the licensed financial institution's records are what I analyzed," she said. "And they don't say what Mr. Crow's lawyers are claiming they say. You're welcome to go through them yourself if you'd like to verify." The room was very quiet for a moment. The judge made a sound that might have been almost anything. The ruling came the following afternoon. Clara sat in the courtroom and heard the judge read it and understood, before he was halfway through, which direction it was going, not from the language but from the pace of it, the order in which he addressed the arguments. He spent almost no time on Crow's side. He spent considerable time on the 1866 permit and what it established about the timeline of the diversion. The diversion had been illegal. The original watercourse carried the prior legal claim. The Valley Land and Water Association's authority over water rights in the valley was voided. Ranchers who had been paying into the association since 1866 were entitled to pursue damages in a separate proceeding. Crow's senior lawyer said something to him in a low voice. Crow was looking at the table in front of him with an expression that had gone entirely flat, the calculation in it replaced by something Clara couldn't name and didn't particularly want to. Silas, sitting beside her, let out a breath that he'd probably been holding since they walked into the building. Aldous, in the row behind them, said something under his breath that Clara didn't catch, but that didn't sound like it needed translation. Franklin Greer, across the aisle, had his wife's hand in both of his and was looking at the judge's bench with the look of a man who had not let himself believe it was possible until this moment, and was now recalibrating everything. Cass leaned over to Clara and said quietly, "Well done." "You did the legal work," she said. "You did everything else." He was already gathering his papers. "The damages proceedings will take time. I want you to know that going in. This isn't over. It's the beginning of a longer process." "I know," Clara said. "Are you prepared for that?" She looked at the room around her, at Silas, at the Greers, at Aldous with his white hair and his years of stubbornness that had turned out, in the end, to be worth something, at the empty space at Crow's table where he had been sitting until a few moments ago, when he'd gotten up and walked out without looking at anyone. "Yes," she said, "I'm prepared." Outside the courthouse, in the hard September light, the valley's ranchers stood in the street and talked to each other in a way they hadn't since before the drought had made every man feel alone with his own survival. The Packard brothers were talking to Franklin Greer. Aldous was talking to Silas. Margaret Greer found Clara near the wagon and took her hand without saying anything first, just held it for a moment, and Clara let her. "What happens to the water now?" Margaret asked. "The original course would need to be restored or the rights redistributed according to the original surveys. That's a separate process." Clara paused. "It'll take time." "But it'll happen." "It'll happen." Margaret nodded. She released Clara's hand. "Franklin kept those records for 7 years," she said. "He thought I was being stubborn about it." "You were right." "Yes." She looked at the street, at the people gathered in it. "We were right, and we still lost our land." Clara didn't try to improve on that. It was true, and Margaret Greer deserved to have it be true without someone papering over it. "I know," she said. "The damages case. I'm not talking about money." Margaret looked at her. "I'm talking about the years. You can't get those back." "No, Sha," Clara said. "You can't." They stood together in the September light, and around them the valley's ranchers talked and the horses waited and the dust settled, and it was not a perfect moment. It was a real one, complicated and incomplete and carrying the weight of everything it had cost to get here. Clara felt the notebook in her coat pocket, the folded survey maps, the months of early mornings and cold coffee, and the specific exhaustion of work that required not just effort, but the constant management of uncertainty. She thought about the street in Red Hollow, the dust on her hands, the laughter. She thought about the room that smelled of onions and the lamp on the kitchen table, and Silas handing her a clean towel on her first night at the ranch. She thought about what it meant to find something worth doing and do it as well as she could. The sun was going west. It was time to start the drive back. The drive back from the courthouse took the better part of 2 days, and for most of it Clara slept. Not the whole time. She was awake for the first few hours, sitting beside Silas on the wagon bench while the evening came on and the road unspooled behind them and the others gradually fell quiet in the wagon following. But somewhere around the second hour, the particular exhaustion that had been building since August finally collected what it was owed, and she leaned sideways against the side panel of the wagon and was gone before she'd decided to sleep. She woke once, briefly, in the deep part of the night. The wagon had stopped. They'd made camp at the side of the road, the horses unhitched and watered. Someone had put a blanket over her. She didn't know who. She looked at the stars for a few minutes, which were very bright and very indifferent in the way stars are, and then she went back to sleep. In the morning, Silas had coffee going before anyone else was fully awake. He handed her a tin cup without comment, and she drank it standing by the wagon, still wrapped in the blanket, and she thought, this is what it feels like when something is over, not triumphant, just emptied out in a way that's different from defeated. The specific quiet of a thing that has been finished. How are you feeling? Silas asked. Tired, she said. That's honest. I don't have the energy for anything else right now. He almost smiled. Not quite. We should be back by afternoon. She nodded and drank her coffee and watched the Texas morning come up gray and then gold over the eastern hills, and she thought about what came next, which was the part she hadn't let herself think about during the months when the case had consumed everything. There was a damages proceeding still ahead. There was the question of restoring the watercourse, which Cass had said would require a separate engineering survey and probably another legal filing. There was the valley itself, which had been shaped by Crow's arrangement for nearly a decade and would need time to reorganize around a different reality. There was also the question of what she was doing here, not in an existential sense, in the plain, practical sense of a woman who had arrived on a temporary arrangement that had become something else entirely without anyone saying so out loud. She hadn't let herself look at it directly. She looked at it now, in the early morning, with the blanket around her shoulders and the tin cup warm in her hands. She had a room at the ranch. She had work that mattered. She had, tentatively and imperfectly, something that felt like people who counted on her. Those were not nothing. Those were, in fact, more than she'd had most of her life. But she didn't know what Silas thought the arrangement was going forward, and she wasn't sure how to ask. Whoops. Red Hollow knew before they got back. That was the first surprise. Word had traveled the way word travels in small places, faster than horses, through channels that couldn't be fully explained. By the time the two wagons came down the main street of Red Hollow in the early afternoon, there were people standing on the porches who had clearly been waiting. Aldis's wife met her husband at the edge of town and put her hand on his arm, and they stood together for a moment in the street. The Packard brothers were greeted by two other ranchers Clara recognized from the valley, men who had sold out the previous year and who now stood with expressions she couldn't quite read, something between relief and grief, the complicated look of people for whom good news has come late enough to also be a reminder of what it cost. Clara sat in the wagon and watched this, and felt like a person watching something through a window, present but not quite part of it. She'd done her piece. What happened in Red Hollow's main street was the valley's story, not specifically hers. Then the woman who had said, "Lord have mercy" on the day Clara collapsed in the street, she recognized her, had placed the voice months ago, came off the porch of the general store and walked directly to the wagon and looked up at Clara. Her name was Edna Marsh. Clara had learned that. She ran the dry goods counter at the general store and had lived in Red Hollow since before there was much of a Red Hollow to live in. She was approximately 60 and had the forthright manner of a woman who had outlasted enough of her own mistakes to have given up on performing composure. "I owe you an apology," Edna said. Blunt, no preamble. Clara looked at her. "All right. When you came into town, what I said." She didn't look away. "That wasn't right." "No," Clara said. "It wasn't." Edna absorbed that. "I know it doesn't fix anything." "It doesn't," Clara agreed. "But I appreciate you saying it." It wasn't a warm exchange. Neither of them pretended it was. But there was something real in it. The specific realness of an accounting that doesn't try to be more than it is. Edna Marsh nodded once and went back to her porch, and Clara watched her go and felt something she couldn't name precisely. Something between forgiveness and the recognition that some things don't need forgiving so much as simply acknowledging. They happened. They were what they were. The question was what you did after. Silas pulled the wagon up to the livery, and they unhitched the horses, and when Clara climbed down from the bench, she found Tom and Eddie and Garfield and Pete all there, which she hadn't expected. They'd ridden in from the ranch, apparently, when word reached them. Eddie was grinning in his uncomplicated way. Garfield looked at her with the brief nod that was his version of effusion. Pete was chewing on his piece of straw. "Well," Eddie said. "We won," Clara said. Eddie made a sound that was approximately a whoop, checked himself, looked around, and then made it again more quietly because apparently he'd decided he didn't care. Tom put his hand out and she shook it, and the handshake was firm and lasted exactly the right amount of time, and that was Tom's version of everything he wanted to say. "Cass said the damages case will take time," she told them, because they deserve the full picture. "And the watercourse restoration is separate. This isn't done. It's just the first part that's done." "But Crow's finished," Pete said. "His authority over the valley water is finished. What he does from here—" She paused. "I don't know, he still has the bank." "Not for long," Aldous said from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. "Word I'm getting is the federal ruling's going to trigger a review of the bank's practices. Something about how the loans were structured against the water rights." He looked at her steadily. Cass mentioned it to Franklin on the ride back. Clara hadn't known that. She hadn't asked Cass enough questions about the secondary implications, which was a gap in her thinking she filed away to examine later. "That could take a year or more to work through." "Yes," Aldous said, "but it's working through." The ranch was quiet when they got back, which was its own kind of welcome. The horses needed attention after 2 days of road, and Clara helped with that without being asked, working beside Pete in the late afternoon with a comfortable absence of conversation. The kitchen needed a full restocking. They'd been running on minimal supplies while the trip consumed everyone's attention. And she went through the inventory with the systematic attention she always brought to it, noting what needed to be ordered and what could wait. She was still in the kitchen, writing out the supply list, when Silas came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She didn't look up immediately because she was in the middle of a calculation, but she was aware of him the way she'd become aware of things at this ranch, without drama, just present in her understanding of the space. "I need to talk to you," he said. "All right." She finished the number she was writing and set down the pencil. He came in and sat down at the table across from her, which was where he always sat, and she thought, whatever this is, at least he's sitting down for it. That meant it wasn't a quick thing. "Quick things," Silas said, standing in doorways. "When you came here," he started, then stopped. She waited. "When I offered you work, I didn't know what I was offering exactly. I knew I needed someone who could manage the kitchen and touch the books. I thought I was solving a practical problem." "And you were," Clara said. "I was solving about 1% of it, as it turned out." He looked at the table, then at her. "You found the water rights situation. You built the case. You put the valley's finances in front of a federal judge in a way that held up to 2 lawyers from Austin. That's not what I hired you for." "No," she said carefully. "It's what the situation needed." "Clara." He said her name in the particular way he said it when he wanted her to stop being precise and let him finish. She'd learned that too. "I'm trying to say something and I'm not saying it well." "Take your time." He exhaled, rubbed the back of his neck. "This ranch is—" He stopped again. "When I came back here after my father died, I thought I was just keeping it going, maintaining what he'd built. I wasn't building anything. I was just—" He made a gesture she understood, the gesture of someone describing forward motion that was actually standing still. "And then you came in here with 8 cents and a bleeding hand, and inside of a week you'd found $40 of overcharging at the general store, and inside of 2 months you'd found a fraud that had been running for 9 years. He looked at her. "I don't know what to do with that, except to say that whatever this ranch is now, it's different from what it was before you came. And whatever it becomes, I'd like you to have an actual stake in it." Clara was very still. Not as a hired hand, he said. Not as a bookkeeper with a room off the kitchen. As he picked up her pencil from the table, looked at it, set it back down. I have the deed to this property. My father's name and then my name. I want to add yours. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not a man who performed things, which meant this was not a performance, which meant she had to take it seriously. Silas, she said, before you argue, I'm not going to argue. I'm going to ask you whether you've thought about this properly. I've thought about almost nothing else since we left the courthouse. There are practical implications, legal implications. People in this valley will have opinions. People in this valley just watched you save their water and their land, he said. Their opinions are changing. Edna Marsh came and apologized to you in the street. Edna Marsh apologized because she felt guilty, not because the valley has fundamentally changed its thinking about who I am. Maybe not everyone, but some things have changed and they're not going to change back. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to care about what people think. I'm asking what you think. Clara sat with that for a moment. Outside, the evening was coming in warm and dry, same as every evening had been all summer. But there was something different in it that she'd noticed on the drive back. A slight heaviness in the air, a smell that was different from the drought smell she'd grown used to. The sky to the west had gone a particular color. I think it might rain, she said. Silas stared at her. Tomorrow, maybe. The air's different. She looked at him, and there was something in her face that was not deflection, but the careful look of someone approaching something real from the side, because approaching it directly felt too large. I'm not saying no. What are you saying? I'm saying I've been in this room off the kitchen for 3 months, and I've been grateful for it, and I haven't wanted anything beyond what was in front of me, because wanting things that aren't in front of you is how you end up walking 3 miles in the Texas heat with 8 cents. She paused. I'm saying I don't know how to want more than what I've already got without being afraid of it. Silas was quiet for a moment. What would make you less afraid of it? Probably doing it and finding out it didn't kill me. He looked at her, and this time the thing that was almost a smile became an actual one. Not large, not performed, just real, appearing on his face like something that had been there for a while and finally had permission. That's the most honest thing I've heard anyone say in years. I try. He reached across the table and put his hand down flat, not reaching for her hand, just putting his there. She looked at it. Then she put hers beside it, not quite touching, and they sat like that for a moment with the evening coming through the window and the kitchen around them smelling of the day's bread and the lamp not yet lit. I want to know something, she said. Ask. The first day, in the street, when you helped me up. She looked at him. Why? Everyone else was watching. It wasn't... She tried to find the right word. It wasn't the practical choice. He thought about it. Actually thought. Which was one of the things she respected about him most. You didn't look helpless, he said finally. You looked angry, and someone who's angry at the situation instead of giving into it... He paused. I don't know. I wanted to see what happened next. Clara sat with that. Outside, the first sound of thunder, distant, far off to the west, barely a sound at all. Both of them heard it. Both of them looked toward the window. It's going to rain, she said again. They went outside. The whole crew came out eventually, pulled by the same instinct. The smell of it, the change in the air, the way the horses in the pasture had gone restless and alert. The clouds coming from the west were dark at the bottom, the real kind of clouds, not the ones that pass through without delivering. Tom stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and looked at the sky with an expression Clara had never seen on him. Open, almost young. Pete pulled the straw from the corner of his mouth and held it between 2 fingers and forgot about it. Eddie said something under his breath that was probably not appropriate but that nobody objected to. The first drops came while they were standing there. Not many at first. Just the scouts, the individual drops that hit the dry ground and were absorbed immediately, disappearing into the cracked earth without a trace, as if the ground were so thirsty it couldn't even form a puddle. Then more. Then the smell that Clara had grown up knowing and had not smelled in months. The smell of rain on dry ground, which is one of those smells that lives in the oldest part of the brain and means something before your thinking mind has gotten to it. She stood in the yard in the rain with her face turned up and felt it on her skin, and she was aware that she was standing in the yard of a ranch that had her name on the deed, or would have once the paperwork was done, which Silas had already said he'd take care of this week, and that the people around her were people she had cooked for and argued with and been seen by and had, in some way that she didn't have a clean word for, chosen and been chosen by. She didn't think of this as something she'd earned exactly. She'd worked hard, and she'd been lucky, and she'd made the right decisions more often than the wrong ones, but she'd also walked into the right town and been helped up by the right man and had access to ledgers that happened to contain the right information at the right time. You could call that effort, but it was also just how things fell. She was too honest with herself to dress it up as pure merit. What she thought was this: that the difference between surviving and living was not a dramatic line, but a quiet one. It was the difference between a room you stay in because you have nowhere else to go and a room you stay in because you have decided to. It was the difference between work you do to keep yourself fed and work you do because it is yours and it matters. It was the difference between people who tolerate you and people who have, over time and through ordinary daily accumulation, become something like yours. She was 23 years old, and she had been laughed at in the street of this town not 4 months ago. She had not forgotten it. She did not think she was supposed to forget it. It was part of what was true, same as the rest of it. But she was standing in the rain in the yard of her ranch, and inside there was a kitchen that she had organized, and a set of books that told the true story of this place, and a table where she had sat across from people who had learned to trust her judgment, and something that had been held very tightly in the center of her chest since she'd walked out of Abilene had loosened, finally, into something that felt not easy. Not that, but possible, real, like ground under her feet that would hold. The rain came harder. Tom laughed, actually laughed, the real kind. And it was such a surprising sound that Eddie looked at him and started laughing too. And even Garfield, who had not audibly laughed once in the entire time Clara had been here, made a sound that was adjacent to it. Silas stood a few feet from Clara and watched the rain hit the dry ground and begin, for the first time in months, to pool. "You were right," he said, to no one in particular. "About which thing?" she said. "The rain." She looked at the sky. "I usually am," she said. "About most things. Not all things, but most." He looked at her sideways. "I'm working on the humility," she said. "Give me time." He did laugh then, properly, and it changed his whole face. She'd seen glimpses of it before, but not the full version, and she looked at it and thought, there it is. There's the thing that was underneath all that stillness. She looked back at the rain and let it fall on her, and thought about the families in the valley who would feel this same rain on their land tonight. The Greers in Caldwell, Aldous and his wife, the Packard brothers, the ranchers who had held on through the drought and the fear and the pressure and were now standing on the other side of it, wet and astonished. She thought about the families who had sold out and were watching from somewhere else, who had a damages case waiting and would wait longer. She thought about the old riverbed with its dark soil at 8 inches, and what it would mean when the water rights were formally redistributed and the valley's water found its way back to where it had been before anyone decided to move it. None of it was finished. The damages case would drag through the winter. The watercourse restoration would require things she couldn't fully predict yet. Crow was not gone from the world, only from his position in this valley, and men like that had a way of finding other positions. There would be more work, more problems, more mornings at the kitchen table with the lamp and the ledgers, and the particular exhaustion of paying close attention to things that mattered. She found that she didn't mind that. She found, standing in the rain with her hair coming down and her dress soaked through, and the crew of the Mercer Ranch laughing and talking around her, that she was not afraid of more work, that the prospect of it felt like something to move toward rather than something to outlast. That was new. That was, she thought, probably what people meant when they talked about home. Not a place that required nothing of you, but a place where what was required of you was worth giving. She pushed her wet hair back from her face. Silas was still standing near her, watching the rain measure itself in the hoof prints in the yard. "The supply order," she said. He turned to look at her. "What?" "I was writing the supply order when you came in. I need to finish it tonight if we're going to get the Millbrook run done by the 1st of the month." He stared at her for a moment, then he shook his head slowly. We just won a federal water rights case, and it's raining for the first time in 4 months. Which is why the supply order matters. If this rain holds, we'll have actual pasture again by late October, which means the cattle situation changes, which means we need to adjust the feed order before we... Clara. What? The supply order will be there in an hour. She looked at the rain. At the yard filling slowly with water, the horses moving happily in the pasture, the crew of men standing in the downpour as if standing under it long enough might make up for all the months it hadn't come. At Silas Mercer beside her, soaked and unhurried and looking at her with the expression she'd seen on his face the first time in the kitchen, that quiet recalibration, that slight shift, like a man revising a picture he'd thought was finished. All right, she said. She turned her face up to the rain again. She stayed.